picture a grand 1920s theatre, where a dazzling soprano collapses mid-song, poisoned by a sip of water. In the quaint village of St. Mary Mead, Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and gentle cunning, unravels a web of secrets. A volatile conductor, a devoted assistant, an obsessive fan, and a ruthless rival. Each hides a motive, but only one laced the glass with deadly intent. As whispers swirl and clues emerge, Miss Marple sets a trap to catch a killer, proving that in this quiet village, ambition can be as lethal as poison. Chapter 1. The Gala Evening. The air in St. Mary's Theatre was thick with the scent of polished wood and expensive perfume, a rare elegance for the modest village of St. Mary Mead. The charity concert, organised to fund a new wing for the local hospital, had drawn a crowd that spilled from the velvet-upholstered seats to the standing-room corners. Chandeliers cast a golden glow over the audience, their murmurs rising like a tide before the performance. In the third row, Miss Jane Marple sat unobtrusively, her small figure wrapped in a lavender shawl, her hands folded neatly over a worn reticule. Her eyes, bright and sharp as a sparrow's, darted across the room, taking in every detail with the quiet precision of a woman who missed nothing. The stage was set for Madame Clara Villon, a soprano whose name had once graced the opera houses of Milan and Paris, but who now lent her talents to such provincial causes. Her reputation preceded her, and the villagers whispered of her luminous voice and imperious demeanour. Miss Marple, however, was more interested in the figures orbiting the diva than in the diva herself. To her left she noted Maestro Julian Hargreaves, the conductor, his broad shoulders hunched over the podium as he scribbled last-minute notes on his score. His dark hair, streaked with silver, was dishevelled, and his fingers twitched with a nervous energy that seemed at odds with his commanding presence. Nearby, Emily Trent, Madame Villon's young assistant, flitted about the wings, her plain face flushed with the weight of her duties. She carried a tray with a single glass of water, which she placed carefully on a small table at the stage's edge. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the girl's anxious movements, noting the way her eyes flicked toward the audience, as if searching for someone. In the front row, Mr. Percival Wren, a local bachelor of middle age, clutched a bouquet of roses with a fervour that suggested more than casual admiration. His round face glistened with perspiration, and his lips moved silently, as though rehearsing words he dared not speak aloud. But it was Miss Lydia Crane, seated several rows behind, who drew Miss Marple's keenest interest. The understudy, a striking woman with raven hair and a sharp jawline, wore a smile that did not reach her eyes. Village gossip had painted her as Madame Villon's rival, a singer of considerable talent whose career had been eclipsed by the older woman's star. Her crimson gown was a shade too bold for the occasion, Miss Marple thought, and her gloved hands were clenched tightly in her lap, betraying a tension that belied her poised exterior. The lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the crowd. Madame Villon emerged from the wings, her presence a vision of grace in a gown of midnight blue, her auburn hair swept into an elegant chignon. She paused at the table, her fingers brushing the glass of water as she offered the audience a regal nod. Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in her hand, a detail that might have escaped less observant eyes. Was it nerves, fatigue, or something else? The old lady filed the observation away, her mind already weaving threads of possibility. The orchestra struck its first notes, a swelling chord that heralded the opening of Puccini's O mio babbino caro. Madame Vionne's voice rose, pure and crystalline, filling the hall with a warmth that seemed to melt the very walls. The audience leaned forward, enraptured, but Miss Marple's attention remained divided. She watched Maestro Hargreaves's baton, its movements precise, yet somehow strained. Emily Trent, now hovering in the shadows, her hands twisting her apron. Mr. Wren, whose eyes never left the singer, and Miss Crane, whose smile had hardened into something almost predatory. Halfway through the aria, a discordant note broke the spell. Madame Vionne's voice faltered. Her hand flew to her throat, and her eyes widened in a flash of panic. The glass of water slipped from her grasp, shattering on the stage, and she crumpled to the floor, her gown pooling like ink. A collective gasp rose from the audience, followed by cries of alarm. Maestro Hargreaves dropped his baton. Emily Trent rushed forward with a stifled sob, and missed her. Wren half rose from his seat, his bouquet falling forgotten to the floor. Only Miss Crane remained still, her expression unreadable. Miss Marple's knitting needles, tucked into her reticule, remained untouched, but her mind was already at work. As Dr. Haydock pushed through the crowd to the stage, she leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. A tragedy was unfolding, and she knew, with the certainty of long experience, that it was no accident. Someone in this glittering hall had orchestrated more than music tonight. Chapter 2. The Immediate Aftermath. The St. Mary's Theatre. Moments ago a haven of melody and light, now pulsed with the discordant rhythm of panic. The audience, still reeling from Madame Clara Vionne's collapse, buzzed with whispers and stifled cries, their elegant attire at odds with the chaos that had erupted. Ushers struggled to maintain order as curious onlookers pressed toward the stage, while others, pale and shaken, lingered in their seats, clutching programs as if they might anchor them to normalcy. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her unobtrusive spot in the third row, remained calm, her lavender shawl draped neatly over her shoulders. Her sharp eyes, undimmed by age, darted across the scene, cataloguing every gesture, every glance, with the precision of a naturalist observing a rare species. Her reticule rested in her lap, but her mind was far from idle, already sifting through the evening's events like a gardener turning soil. On the stage, Doctor. Haydock knelt beside Madame Vionne, his weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency. The soprano lay motionless, her midnight blue gown fanned out like a fallen peacock's tail, her auburn hair loosened from its chignon. The doctor's face, usually genial, was set in a grim line as he pressed 2 fingers to her wrist. "She's alive," he announced, his voice cutting through the clamour. "But she's in a bad way. Dilated pupils, shallow breathing, poison, I'd wager, and a nasty one at that." His words sent a fresh ripple of shock through the crowd, and Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Poison, she thought, was a peculiarly intimate crime, requiring both access and intent. Her gaze flicked to the shattered glass on the stage, its contents seeping into the polished wood, and she made a mental note of its position relative to the small table. Maestro Julian Hargreaves, his conductor's poise abandoned, stood frozen at the podium, his baton dangling uselessly from his hand. His florid complexion had drained to an ashen hue, and his eyes darted nervously toward the wings, as if expecting an explanation to emerge from the shadows. Emily Trent, the young assistant, hovered near the fallen singer, her hands clasped tightly, her plain face streaked with tears. "Oh, madame, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. Mr. Percival Wren, the devoted fan, had pushed his way to the edge of the stage, his bouquet discarded, his round face a mask of distress. Only Miss Lydia Crane, the rival, remained seated, her crimson gown a stark contrast to the pale faces around her. Her hands were still, but Miss Marple noted the faintest tremor in her gloved fingers, betraying a tension that her serene expression sought to conceal. The theatre doors swung open, admitting Inspector Craddock and a small contingent of constables, their heavy footsteps echoing in the now silent hall. Craddock, a tall man with a methodical air and a face that suggested he preferred paperwork to theatrics, surveyed the scene with a practiced eye. He had worked with Miss Marple before, and though he respected her insight, he often found her gentle probing exasperating. "Clear the stage, please," he ordered, his voice firm but not unkind. "And nobody leaves until we've spoken to you." The constables moved swiftly, cordoning off the area around Madame Vionna's doctor. Haydock supervised her transfer to a stretcher. A pair of ambulance men summoned from the village carried her out, their faces grim under the weight of their task. Miss Marple, unnoticed amid the bustle, slipped from her seat and made her way toward the backstage area, her movements as unobtrusive as a shadow. She had no official role, of course, but her reputation in St. Mary Mead granted her a certain latitude. The constables, accustomed to her presence at such scenes, barely glanced her way as she passed through the velvet curtains into the dimly lit corridor beyond. The green room, a cluttered space filled with costumes and props, was her destination. It was here, she knew, that the glass of water had been prepared, and here that the truth might begin to reveal itself. The green room was a hive of nervous activity. Stage hands whispered in corners, their voices low and urgent, while a young woman in a black dress, likely a dresser, sobbed quietly into a handkerchief. Emily Trent stood near a table, her hands twisting her apron as she spoke to a constable. "I filled the glass myself," she was saying, her voice quavering, "from the jug right there." Madame always insists on room-temperature water, never iced. "I left it on the table by the stage, just as she likes," the constable, a young man with a notepad, scribbled diligently, but Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the jug itself, a simple glass vessel still half full, its surface catching the light from a nearby lamp. She approached, her steps slow and deliberate, and bent slightly to examine it. There was no visible residue, no telltale scent, but she knew better than to trust appearances alone. "Miss Trent," she said softly, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze, "you're quite certain you didn't leave the glass unattended at any point?" Emily's eyes widened and she flushed, her hands pausing in their nervous dance. I don't think so," she stammered. "I mean, I stepped away for a moment to fetch some sheet music from Madame's dressing room, but it was only a minute, maybe two." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of kindly understanding, but her mind was already turning over the implications. A minute or two was more than enough for a practiced hand to tamper with the glass. She made a note to ask about the dressing room later, for it was another point of access, another thread in the web. As the constable moved on to question a stagehand, Miss Marple drifted toward the edge of the room, where a narrow hallway led to the performers' dressing rooms. The air was cooler here, and the sounds of the theatre faded to a muffled hum. She paused outside Madame Vion's dressing room, its door ajar, revealing a chaos of cosmetics, sheet music, and a velvet cape draped over a chair. A faint scent lingered, not a perfume, but something sharper, chemical. Miss Marple's nose wrinkled, and she filed the detail away, knowing it might prove significant. She did not enter, for that would be too forward, even for her, but she lingered long enough to note the proximity of Miss Crane's dressing room, just 2 doors down. Back in the green room, Inspector Craddock had arrived, his notebook open and his expression one of determined focus. He was questioning Maestro, Hargreaves, who had regained some of his composure but still looked rattled, his cufflinks glinting as he twisted them nervously. "I was at the podium the entire time," the Maestro insisted, his voice booming despite the circumstances. "I saw nothing, heard nothing, until she collapsed. It's preposterous to think I'd have anything to do with this." Craddock raised an eyebrow but said nothing, jotting down the Maestro's words with a steady hand. Miss Marple, standing just out of earshot, noted the conductor's defensiveness, the way his eyes avoided the jug on the table. Was it guilt, she wondered, or merely the shock of the moment? Mr. Percival Wren had been corralled by another constable, his nervous laughter filling the room as he recounted his evening. "I was in the audience, front row," he said, his voice high and unsteady. "I brought flowers for Madame Vion, as I always do. I'd never harm her. She's a goddess." His adoration was almost comical, but Miss Marple's lips tightened. Fanaticism, she knew, could twist devotion into something darker. She recalled seeing him near the stage door before the concert, speaking heatedly to someone in the shadows. Had he been closer to the stage than he claimed? She resolved to press him later, in her own gentle way. Miss Lydia Crane, summoned from the auditorium, entered the green room with the grace of a cat, her crimson gown catching the light. Her face was a mask of concern, but her eyes were cold, calculating. "I was in my dressing room until just before the performance," she told Craddock, her voice smooth as silk. "I heard the commotion and came out to see what had happened." Poor Clara. The use of Madame Vion's first name struck Miss Marple as overly familiar, a subtle jab at the older woman's status. She noted, too, the way Lydia's gloved hands remained folded, as if guarding something. The chemical scent from the dressing room lingered in her mind, and she wondered if Miss Crane's composure was as flawless as it seemed. As the police continued their interviews, Miss Marple returned to the auditorium, slipping back into her seat as if she had never left. The audience had been asked to remain, and the air was thick with speculation. Mrs. Bantry, a friend from the village, leaned over, her eyes wide. "Jane, isn't it dreadful? Poison, they say. Who could do such a thing?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles now clicking softly in her lap. "People are capable of surprising things, Dolly," she said, her tone mild but her mind racing. She thought of her garden, where a careless neighbour had once left a bottle of weed killer, its contents deadly if misused. Poison, she mused, was a weapon of opportunity, but also of intent. Someone had planned this. Someone with access to that glass. Someone with a reason to want Madame Vion silenced. The constable guarding the stage approached Craddock, holding a small evidence bag. Inside was the broken, glass carefully collected, its jagged edges glinting under the lights. "We'll have it tested," Craddock said, his voice low. "If it's poison, we'll know soon enough." Miss Marple's eyes followed the bag, her thoughts turning to the jug, the dressing rooms, the fleeting moments when the glass had been left unattended. She knew the truth lay in the small things. The overlooked glances, the unguarded moments, the traces left behind by careless hands. As the audience was finally dismissed, Miss Marple rose, her shawl adjusted with care. She would return home to her cottage, where a cup of tea and a quiet evening awaited, but her work was far from done. The threads of this mystery were tangled, but she had unravelled such knots before. Maestro Hargreaves, with his nervous cufflinks, Emily Trent with her tearful devotion, Mr. Wren with his obsessive adoration, Miss Crane with her icy ambition, each held a piece of the puzzle, and Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and relentless curiosity, would find a way to fit them together. Chapter 3. The Conductor's Temper, the morning after the calamity at St. Mary's Theatre, the village of St. Mary Mead buzzed with a nervous energy, as if the very cobblestones whispered of poison and betrayal. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cosy parlour, the fire casting a warm glow over her chintz curtains and the small table where her breakfast tray rested. A pot of tea steamed gently, but her attention was fixed on the morning's newspaper, its headline proclaiming, "Soprano stricken at charity concert, foul play suspected." The article was sparse on details, but Miss Marple's mind was already piecing together the fragments of the previous evening, her thoughts as precise as the stitches in the scarf she knitted absent-mindedly. She had risen early, as was her habit, and taken a short walk through her garden, where the autumn roses still clung to their blooms. The sight of her weed-killer bottle, neatly stored in the shed, had reminded her of the poison's insidious nature. Silent, subtle, and requiring only a moment's opportunity. Now, as she sipped her tea, she considered the players in this drama. Maestro Julian Hargreaves, the conductor, had caught her eye last night with his florid face and restless hands. His outburst to Inspector Craddock, though vehement, had carried a note of unease, and Miss Marple knew that such bluster often masked a deeper disquiet. She resolved to learn more about him, and fortune, as it often did, provided an opportunity. At mid-morning, Miss Marple donned her best hat, a sensible affair with a single feather, and made her way to the village hall, where the orchestra was rehearsing for a smaller performance scheduled later in the week. The hall, a modest building with creaking floorboards and a faint smell of wax, was alive with the tentative strains of strings and woodwinds. Maestro Hargreaves stood at the centre, his baton slashing the air with a vigour that bordered on ferocity. The musicians, a mix of local talent and hired professionals, responded with precision, but Miss Marple noted a tension in their postures, as if they feared his temper as much as they respected his skill. She slipped into a seat at the back, her presence unnoticed by all but Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife, who offered a nod and a whispered, "Dreadful business last night, Jane." Miss Marple murmured agreement, her eyes fixed on the maestro. His dark coat was immaculate, but his hair was dishevelled, and his cufflinks, silver with an intricate design, flashed as he gestured. She recalled their nervous twisting the previous evening, a habit that suggested more than mere agitation. As the rehearsal paused, she approached, her step soft and her smile disarming. "Good morning, Maestro," she said, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "I do hope you're managing under such trying circumstances." Hargreaves turned, his expression a mix of surprise and irritation, but her kindly demeanour softened his scowl. "Miss Marple, is it? Yes, well, it's a beastly affair. Poor Clara. Madame Vion, I mean. I can't fathom who'd do such a thing." His voice was gruff, but his eyes avoided hers, drifting to the musicians packing their instruments. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of mild curiosity. "It must be dreadfully upsetting, especially for someone so dedicated to the music. I understand you and Madame Vion had some artistic differences?" Her tone was innocent, but her question landed like a pebble in a still pond. Hargreaves's face reddened, and he tugged at his cufflinks, the gesture betraying his discomfort. "Differences? She insisted on that wretched Puccini piece. Too taxing for the orchestra, I told her. But she wouldn't listen. Thinks she's still at La Scala, you know." His voice rose, drawing glances from the musicians. "But poison? Absurd. I was at the podium, in full view. Ask anyone." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly in her reticule. "Of course," she said soothingly. "It's just that such disagreements can weigh heavily, can't they? Especially with so much at stake for the concert." Hargreaves muttered something about schedules and turned back to his score. But Miss Marple had seen enough. His temper, she mused, was genuine, but his defensiveness suggested something unspoken. She thanked him and withdrew, pausing to chat with Mrs. Price, who mentioned in passing that the maestro had been seen at the local pub, arguing with a man about unpaid debts. "Gambling, I shouldn't wonder," Mrs. Price whispered, her eyes gleaming with gossip. Miss Marple filed the tidbit away, knowing that financial strain could push even a proud man to desperate acts. As she left the hall, she encountered Inspector Craddock, who was striding toward the theatre with a purposeful air. "Miss Marple," he greeted, tipping his hat, "I suppose you're already unravelling this mess in that head of yours." His tone was half teasing, half resigned, for he knew her knack for seeing what others missed. She smiled demurely. "I'm only an old lady with too much time, Inspector. But I did notice Maestro Hargreaves seemed rather unsettled last night. Have you spoken to him?" Craddock nodded, flipping open his notebook. "First thing this morning. He's all bluster. Claims he was too busy conducting to meddle with any glass. His alibi holds for now. Half the orchestra saw him at the podium. But we're testing the jug and the glass fragments. The lab says it's likely an alkaloid, fast-acting but not immediately fatal. Madame Vion's stable, thank heavens, but she's not out of danger." Miss Marple's eyes brightened at the mention of the alkaloid, her mind drifting to her neighbour's weed killer and its chemical cousins. "An alkaloid," she mused aloud. "How precise. And how convenient for someone who knew exactly when Madame would drink." Craddock raised an eyebrow. But before he could respond, a young constable hurried over, his face flushed. "Sir, we've found something in the green room, a scrap of paper near the jug with some numbers scribbled on it. Could be nothing, but—" He trailed off, handing Craddock a small evidence bag. Miss Marple leaned forward, her curiosity piqued, but Craddock tucked the bag away. "We'll look into it," he said briskly. "Miss Marple, you'll let me know if you notice anything, won't you?" She nodded, her smile serene, but her mind was already turning over the new clue. Numbers, she thought, could mean debts, a code, or even a time, each a potential thread in the tapestry of motive. As she walked home, the autumn air crisp against her cheeks, Miss Marple considered Maestro Hargreaves. His temper was a liability, but was it a mask for something darker? His cufflinks, his debts, his clash with Madame Villon, all were pieces of a puzzle, but none yet fit perfectly. She thought of her nephew Raymond, whose impulsive nature had once led him into trouble, and how often pride concealed vulnerability. Hargreaves, she suspected, was a man whose pride was both his strength and his weakness. But had it driven him to poison? Or was he, like the roses in her garden, merely wilting under pressure, a distraction from the true culprit? Back at her cottage, she settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed. The scarf grew steadily, its pattern as intricate as the mystery before her. She would watch, she decided, and listen. The village would talk as it always did, and the truth would emerge as surely as her roses bloomed each spring. For now, Maestro Hargreaves remained a question mark, his temper a flare in the fog, but Miss Marple knew that clarity would come with patience and a touch of her own quiet cunning. Chapter 4. The Devoted Assistant. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone lanes of St. Mary Mead, painting the village in hues of gold and amber. Miss Jane Marple, her sensible shoes clicking softly on the path, made her way toward the modest cottage where Emily Trent, Madame Villon's assistant, lodged with her widowed aunt. The air was sharp with the scent of fallen leaves, and Miss Marple pulled her shawl closer, her mind as alert as ever. The events of the previous evening at St. Mary's Theatre lingered like a persistent melody, each note a clue to the puzzle of Madame Villon's poisoning. Emily Trent, with her tearful devotion and fleeting absence from the glass of water, had piqued Miss Marple's curiosity. The young woman's loyalty seemed genuine, but Miss Marple knew that devotion, like a rose in her garden, could hide thorns beneath its bloom. Emily's aunt, Mrs. Glover, welcomed Miss Marple with a nervous smile, her hands dusted with flour from baking. "Oh, Miss Marple, what a dreadful thing," she said, ushering her into a small parlour, cluttered with doilies and faded photographs. "Emily's been beside herself, poor lamb." "She's upstairs, resting or trying to." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, settling into a chintz-covered chair, her reticule in her lap. "It's a terrible shock for us all," she said gently. "I thought I might have a word with Emily, if she's up to it." "Just to see how she's faring." Mrs. Glover hesitated, then nodded, calling up the stairs with the voice that trembled slightly. Emily appeared moments later, her plain face pale and her eyes red-rimmed from crying. Her brown hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her hands twisted a damp handkerchief as she sat across from Miss Marple. "I don't know what to say," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Madame Villon, she's been so kind to me. I'd never hurt her. Never." The words spilled out, raw and unpolished, and Miss Marple's expression softened, though her eyes remained keen, noting the girl's trembling fingers and the faint quiver in her lip. "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said, her tone as soothing as a lullaby. "No one doubts your affection for Madame Villon. But it's the smallest things that help in times like these. You said you filled her glass from the jug in the green room, didn't you?" Emily nodded, her eyes fixed on the floor. Yes, just like always. She's particular about her water. Room temperature, no ice, in a clean glass. I set it on the table by the stage before the concert started. Miss Marple tilted her head. Her needles clickened faintly in her reticule. And you stepped away for a moment, I believe? To fetch some sheet music? Emily's flush deepened, and she bit her lip. Yes, I had to go to her dressing room. She'd misplaced her score for the second aria, and she was in such a state about it. I wasn't gone long, I swear. Just a minute or two. Her voice cracked, and she pressed the handkerchief to her eyes. Miss Marple leaned forward. Her gaze gentle but probing. And in that minute, dear, did you see anyone near the green room? Anyone at all? Emily hesitated, her eyes darting to the side, and Miss Marple noted the pause, brief but telling. No, Emily said at last. I mean, there were stagehands about, and I think I saw Miss Crane in the corridor. But I was in such a rush, I didn't really look. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. The mention of Lydia Crane, so casually dropped, was a thread worth tugging. She thought of her young neighbour Lucy, whose impulsiveness often led her to omit details until pressed, and she suspected Emily's hesitation hid something similar. Miss Crane, you say? She prompted, her voice mild. Was she near the green room, or perhaps closer to the stage? Emily shook her head, her fingers tightening on the handkerchief. I don't know, Miss Marple. It was all so quick. I just wanted to get back to Madame sensing the girl's distress. Miss Marple shifted tack, her tone warm and reassuring. You've been such a help to Madame Villon, haven't you? It must be a great responsibility, looking after someone so talented. Emily's face brightened slightly, a flicker of pride breaking through her anxiety. Oh, yes, she's taught me so much, about music, about poise. She says I've a good ear, even if I'm not a performer. Her voice softened, and Miss Marple noted the genuine admiration, untainted by envy. But admiration, she knew, could be a double-edged sword, binding one to another's will, or to another's secrets. As Mrs. Glover bustled in with a tray of tea and scones, Miss Marple took the opportunity to observe the room. A small photograph on the mantel caught her eye. Emily, younger and smiling, standing beside a young man in a tweed jacket, their hands clasped. Your brother, dear? Miss Marple asked, nodding toward the picture. Emily's flush returned, and she shook her head quickly. No, that's Tom, my friend. He's away at the moment, working in London. Her voice faltered, and Miss Marple made a mental note. A sweetheart, perhaps, and one whose absence seemed to weigh on her. Could he be connected to the events at the theatre? Love, Miss Marple knew, could complicate even the simplest motives. The conversation turned to lighter matters, and Miss Marple sipped her tea, her questions gentle but deliberate. She asked about Emily's duties, the routine of the concert, the comings and goings in the green room. Emily's answers were earnest, but Miss Marple sensed a reticence, as if the girl were guarding something, perhaps not guilt, but a fear of betraying someone else. As she rose to leave, she patted Emily's hand. You've been very brave, my dear. If anything else comes to mind, even the smallest thing, you'll let me know, won't you? Emily nodded, her eyes wide, and Miss Marple departed, her mind already weaving new patterns. Outside, the village was settling into its afternoon rhythm. the postman making his rounds, and children playing near the green. Miss Marple walked slowly, her thoughts on Emily Trent. The girl's devotion was clear, but her brief absence from the glass offered an opportunity for mischief. Had she been careless, or was she protecting someone? The mention of Lydia Crane in the corridor was intriguing, and Miss Marple recalled the chemical scent in the dressing room, so close to the green room's jug. She thought, too, of the scrap of paper Craddock had mentioned, with its cryptic numbers. Could Emily have seen something or someone she was reluctant to name? At her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed. The scarf grew longer, its stitches as orderly as her thoughts. She considered Emily's sweetheart Tom, and the possibility that he might be a factor, however remote. In her experience, young women like Emily could be swayed by love, their loyalty torn between duty and affection. She recalled a case in her youth, when a housemaid's devotion to a scoundrel had led to a theft, and she wondered if Emily's hesitations hid a similar conflict. For now, the assistant remained a question, her tears genuine, but her story incomplete. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting her parlour in twilight, Miss Marple made a note to speak with Inspector Craddock about the scrap of paper. Numbers, she mused, could mean many things: a debt, a time, a code. And Emily, with her access to the glass and her fleeting absence, was a thread that needed careful handling. The truth, Miss Marple knew, lay in the quiet moments, the unguarded glances, and the secrets that even the most devoted heart might keep. Chapter 5. The Adoring Fan. The late afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns across her parlour floor. Outside, St. Mary Mead settled into its evening hush, the distant clatter of a milk cart mingling with the chirp of sparrows. Miss Marple sat in her favourite armchair, a cup of tea cooling beside her, her knitting needles moving with rhythmic precision. The scarf, now a cascade of soft wool, grew steadily, but her thoughts were elsewhere, tethered to the mystery of Madame Vion's poisoning. The image of Mr. Percival Wren, the ardent fan with his crumpled bouquet and nervous laughter, lingered in her mind. His fervent devotion to the soprano, so evident in his trembling hands and adoring gaze, struck her as both touching and troubling. She knew from long experience that obsession, like a weed in her garden, could choke out reason and sprout into something dangerous. Determined to learn more, Miss Marple set out for the village post office, where Mr. Wren served as a clerk. The post office, a squat building with a red-tiled roof, was a hub of gossip, and she hoped to catch him in a moment of candour. As she entered, the bell above the door jingled, and missed her. Wren looked up from sorting letters, his round face flushing at the sight of her. "Miss Marple," he stammered, pushing his spectacles up his nose. "What a surprise! I mean, how can I help you?" His voice carried a nervous edge, and his hands fumbled with a stack of envelopes, scattering them across the counter. "Oh, just a few stamps, dear," Miss Marple said, her smile as disarming as a spring breeze. "And perhaps a moment of your time. It's such a dreadful business about Madame Vion, isn't it?" Mr. Wren's flush deepened, and he nodded vigorously, his eyes darting to the side. "Dreadful, yes. She's a marvel, Madame Vion. Her voice, it's like an angel's. I'd never dream of harming her." His words tumbled out, unprompted, and Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, noting the defensiveness in his tone. She selected a few stamps, her movements slow and deliberate, giving her time to observe him. His tweed jacket was neatly pressed, but a faint stain on his cuff, ink perhaps or something else, caught her eye. "You were at the concert, of course," she said, her voice gentle but probing. "In the front row, with those lovely roses. You must have been terribly shaken when she collapsed." Mr. Wren's hand stilled, and he swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I was devastated," he said. "I couldn't believe it. I wanted to run to her, but the ushers held me back." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking faintly in her reticule. "You're so devoted to her, Mr. Wren. I saw you near the stage door before the concert, didn't I? Speaking to someone, perhaps?" Her question was soft, almost incidental, but it landed like a stone in a still pond. Mr. Wren's face paled, and his fingers twitched, knocking a pen to the floor. "The stage door," he echoed, his voice rising. "Oh, no, I was just waiting, hoping to see her arrive. I didn't speak to anyone, not really." His nervous laugh filled the small room, and Miss Marple's lips pursed, her mind registering the lie as clearly as a false note in a hymn. She thought of her nephew Raymond's friend, a young man whose infatuation with a local actress had led to foolish, reckless acts. Obsession, she knew, could blind one to reason, twisting admiration into something possessive, even destructive. "Of course," she said soothingly, tucking the stamps into her reticule. "It's easy to lose track in all the excitement. But you must have seen something standing so close to the stage. Perhaps someone near Madame's table, or the glass of water." Mr. Wren shook his head, his spectacles slipping again. "No, nothing. I was watching her, only her. She was radiant until—" His voice broke, and he turned away, pretending to sort letters. Miss Marple lingered, her gaze wandering to the counter where a small notebook lay open, its pages filled with cramped handwriting. She glimpsed Madame Vion's name, repeated in fervent scrawls, alongside dates and times that matched her recent performances. A chill ran through her, not from the drafty room, but from the intensity of Mr. Wren's fixation. "You keep such careful records," she remarked, her tone light, "almost like a diary of her concerts." Mr. Wren snatched the notebook, tucking it beneath the counter. "Just notes," he muttered. "I like to remember her performances." As she left the post office, Miss Marple's mind was alight with possibilities. Mr. Wren's devotion was undeniable, but his presence near the stage door and his evasive answers suggested he knew more than he admitted. She recalled the shadowy figure she'd seen him with, their voices low and urgent. Could he have been manipulated, or was his adoration a mask for something darker? She thought of the alkaloid mentioned by Inspector Craddock, a poison requiring knowledge and access. Did Mr. Wren, with his unassuming air and village connections, have the means to procure such a substance? Her walk took her past the village green, where children played and Mrs. Bantry waved from her garden gate. "Jane, any news on that dreadful poisoning?" she called, her voice carrying. Miss Marple smiled, pausing to chat. "Not yet, Dolly, but I'm sure the police are doing their best." Mrs. Bantry leaned closer, her eyes gleaming. "They say Mr. Wren's been acting odd. More than usual, I mean. Always hanging about the theatre when Madame Vion's there. It's not natural, is it?" Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, filing away the gossip. The village, she knew, was a mirror, reflecting truths in its chatter, however distorted. Back at her cottage, she settled into her parlour, the fire crackling softly. Her knitting resumed, the scarf lengthening as her thoughts wove through the mystery. She considered Mr. Wren's notebook, its obsessive entries a window into his mind. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead years ago, when a young man's fixation on a local beauty had led to vandalism, his love twisted by rejection. Could Mr. Wren's adoration have turned to resentment, perhaps spurred by some imagined slight? Or was he a pawn, his presence near the stage door a distraction orchestrated by another? She resolved to share her observations with Inspector Craddock, though she knew he'd sigh at her fancies. The scrap of paper with numbers found near the jug nagged at her. Could it be linked to Mr. Wren's notebook, or was it a separate thread? She thought, too, of the chemical scent in the dressing room, so close to Lydia Crane's door, and wondered if Mr. Wren's fervent loyalty had made him vulnerable to manipulation. As the clock chimed, Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her mind clear. Mr. Wren was a piece of the puzzle, his devotion a bright thread, but whether it led to guilt or innocence remained to be seen. She would watch, as she always did, and the truth would surface as surely as her roses bloomed each spring. Chapter 6. The Rival's Ambition. The evening sky over St. Mary Mead was a tapestry of deepening blues-gun-cue, streaked with crimson and violet, as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the village's only inn, the Blue Boar. The air carried a chill, and she pulled her shawl tighter, her steps measured but purposeful. She had arranged to meet Miss Lydia Crane, Madame Vion's rival and understudy, under the guise of discussing the hospital charity fund. But her true intent was to probe the woman whose sharp smile and sharper ambition had caught her attention at the concert. Miss Marple knew that ambition, like a thorn hidden beneath a rose's petals, could prick deeply, and she suspected Lydia's composure masked a motive as potent as the poison that had felled the soprano. The Blue Boar's parlour was a cosy affair, with low beams and a fire crackling in the hearth. Miss Crane was already there, seated at a corner table, her crimson dress replaced by a tailored green one that accentuated her striking features. Her raven hair was swept into an elegant knot, and her eyes, cool and assessing, met Miss Marple's with a flicker of curiosity. "Miss Marple," she said, rising with a practised smile, "how kind of you to come. I understand you're quite involved in village affairs." Her voice was smooth, almost too smooth, and Miss Marple noted the careful modulation, as if every word were a performance. "Oh, I do what I can," Miss Marple replied, settling into a chair with a smile as warm as the firelight. "It's a small village, and we all try to help one another." She set her reticule on the table, her knitting needles giving a faint click, and ordered tea with a nod to the innkeeper. As they waited, she steered the conversation to the concert, her tone light but deliberate. "Such a shock about Madame Vion. You must be dreadfully worried, being so close to her." Lydia's smile tightened, and she stirred her tea with a delicate hand. "Naturally, it's appalling. Clara is a dear colleague, and I wish her a swift recovery." The words were perfect, but Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the slight clench of her jaw, the way her gloved fingers lingered on the spoon. She thought of her garden, where a climbing rose could choke a weaker plant, and wondered if Lydia's ambition had similarly sought to strangle Madame Vion's spotlight. You were in your dressing room when it happened, I believe?" Miss Marple asked, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "It must have been difficult, preparing to perform, only to have the evening disrupted." Lydia's eyes narrowed, but her composure held. "Yes, I was getting ready. I had no idea anything was wrong until the commotion started." She sipped her tea, her movements precise, but Miss Marple noted a faint tremor in her hand, barely perceptible beneath the glove. The tea arrived, and Miss Marple poured a cup, her movements slow to give herself time to observe. She recalled the chemical scent in the dressing-room corridor, so close to Lydia's door, and the vial she'd later found near the green room. "It's curious," she said, as if musing aloud, "how poison requires such careful planning. Whoever did it must have been very close to that glass of water." Lydia's expression remained serene, but her fingers tightened on her cup. "Indeed," she said, "it's a terrible mystery. I trust the police will find the culprit soon." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly in her reticule. "Oh, Inspector Craddock is thorough." He mentioned a scrap of paper found near the jug with numbers on it. "It's the sort of thing that makes one wonder, isn't it?" Her question was innocent, but her eyes were sharp, watching for a reaction. Lydia's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, and she set her cup down with a faint clink. "Numbers?" she echoed. "How odd!" Perhaps it was nothing, a receipt or a note. Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple sensed a crack in her armour, as if the mention of the paper had struck a nerve. They spoke of the charity fund for a while, Lydia's responses polished but guarded. Miss Marple, however, kept circling back to the concert, her questions as soft as falling leaves. "You must have been disappointed, dear, not to perform. I hear you have a lovely voice, quite comparable to Madame Villon's." The compliment was calculated, and Lydia's eyes flashed with something, pride or resentment. "You're too kind," she said, her smile thin. "But Clara is the star, and I'm happy to support her." The words were correct, but Miss Marple heard the undercurrent of bitterness, like a sour note in a melody. As they parted, Miss Marple thanked Lydia warmly, her mind already turning over the encounter. She walked home through the gathering dusk, the village lamps casting pools of light on the cobblestones. Lydia Crane's ambition was palpable, a force as bright and dangerous as a flame. Miss Marple thought of her neighbour's daughter, whose desire for recognition had once led to a petty betrayal, and wondered if Lydia's hunger for the spotlight had driven her further. The chemical scent, the vial, the numbers on the paper, all pointed to a calculated act, and Lydia's proximity to the scene made her a compelling figure in the puzzle. In her parlour, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. The scarf grew longer, its pattern as intricate as the mystery before her. She considered Lydia's composure, so carefully maintained, and the faint tremor in her hand. Was it guilt, or merely the strain of being questioned? She thought, too, of the alkaloid poison, requiring knowledge and access, and of Lydia's role as understudy, poised to step into Madame Villon's place. The pieces were there, but they had yet to form a complete picture. Miss Marple knew that ambition could be a quiet poison, seeping into the heart until it demanded action. Lydia Crane, with her cool smile and gloved hands, was a thread that needed watching. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's needles clicked, and she resolved to share her thoughts with Inspector Craddock, though she knew he'd sigh at her village parallels. The truth, she felt certain, was close, waiting to be plucked like a rose from the tangle of motives and lies. Chapter 7. The Village Whispers. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of the village's thatched cottages and ancient yews. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her familiar lavender shawl, sat at her breakfast table, the remnants of toast and marmalade before her. The fire in her parlour crackled softly, casting a warm glow over the room's familiar comforts. Chintz curtains, a well-worn armchair, and a small vase of late-blooming roses from her garden. Her knitting lay folded in her reticule, but her hands were still, her mind wholly occupied with the puzzle of Madame Vion's poisoning. The village was alive with whispers, each snippet of gossip a potential thread in the tapestry of motive and opportunity. And Miss Marple knew that such murmurs, however trivial they seemed, often held the key to unravelling a mystery. She sipped her tea, her sharp eyes drifting to the window, where the mist curled like a living thing. The events at St. Mary's Theatre had stirred the village into a frenzy, and she had spent the morning listening to her maid, Cherry, who had a knack for gathering the latest talk. Cherry, bustling in with a fresh pot of tea, was eager to share. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's all anyone can speak of," she said, her eyes wide. "They're saying Maestro Hargreaves was in a right state at the pub last week, shouting about money he owed some city fellow. And that Emily Trent, poor thing, she's been crying non-stop. But Mrs. Glover says she's been getting letters from a lad in London, secret-like, you know." Cherry paused, wiping her hands on her apron. "And then there's Mr. Wren, always mooning over Madame Vion. Folk reckon he's half mad with it." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle interest, but her mind was sorting through the information with the precision of a seamstress threading a needle. "And Miss Crane?" she asked, her voice soft. Cherry's nose wrinkled. "Oh, her. Mrs. Bantry says she's got a sharp tongue and a sharper eye for the stage. Always thought she'd do anything to be the star, they say." Miss Marple thanked Cherry, her thoughts already weaving the gossip into the broader pattern. The village, she knew, was like her garden, full of hidden roots that, when uncovered, revealed unexpected connections. Determined to sift through these whispers, Miss Marple decided to pay a call on Mrs. Bantry, whose sprawling manor, Gossington Hall, was a fountain of local lore. She donned her best coat, a practical grey tweed, and set out, her steps brisk despite the damp chill. The walk took her past the church, where the vicar was polishing the brass, and the post office, where Mr. Wren's nervous silhouette was visible through the window. She noted his hunched posture, as if the weight of the village's scrutiny pressed upon him, and filed it away for later consideration. At Gossington Hall, Mrs. Bantry greeted her with a theatrical sigh, ushering her into a drawing-room cluttered with books and faded grandeur. "Jane, it's simply ghastly," she declared, pouring tea with a flourish. "Poison. In our little village, it's like something out of one of Arthur's detective novels." Her husband, Colonel Bantry, grunted from behind a newspaper, but Miss Marple smiled, settling into a plush chair. "It's certainly unsettling, Dolly. Have you heard anything about the people involved? Maestro Hargreaves, perhaps, or young Emily?" Mrs. Bantry's eyes gleamed, and she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Well, Hargreaves is a mess, isn't he? Always so grand, but I hear he's been borrowing money left and right to cover his gambling. Lost a fortune at cards, they say, and was desperate to keep it quiet. As for Emily, she's sweet enough, but there's talk she's been mooning over some boy who's no good, someone her aunt disapproves of. And Mr. Wren, well, he's practically a shrine to Madame Villon. Keeps a scrapbook of her, did you know? Full of clippings and notes. It's not right, Jane, not at all." Miss Marple's needles clicked faintly in her reticule, a counterpoint to her racing thoughts. The scrapbook intrigued her, echoing the notebook she'd glimpsed at the post office. She thought of a spinster in her youth, who'd kept a diary of a local squire's movements, her fixation leading to a scandalous theft. Could Mr. Wren's obsession have driven him to a darker act? And Hargreaves's debts, could they have pushed him to sabotage the concert, perhaps to deflect attention from his troubles? Emily's secret letters, too, suggested a hidden loyalty, one that might complicate her devotion to Madame Villon. "And Miss Crane," Miss Marple prompted, her tone mild but her eyes sharp. Mrs. Bantry's lips pursed. "Oh, Lydia Crane. She's all charm on the surface, but there's steel underneath. I saw her at the village fete last month, talking to a chemist from Much Benham. Something about theatrical props, she said, but it struck me as odd. She's always wanted Clara's place, hasn't she? And now, with Clara in hospital, she's stepping into the lead for the next concert." Mrs. Bantry's voice dripped with implication, and Miss Marple nodded, her mind returning to the chemical scent near Lydia's dressing room and the vial she'd found. As she left Gossington Hall, the mist had lifted, revealing a sky of pale blue. Miss Marple walked slowly, her thoughts on the villagers' whispers. Each suspect was a thread. Hargreaves with his debts, Emily with her secrets, Wren with his obsession, and Lydia with her ambition, but none yet formed a complete picture. She recalled her garden, where a careless application of weed killer had once killed a prized rose, and thought of the alkaloid poison, so precise in its malice. Whoever had poisoned Madame Villon had access, knowledge, and a reason, and the village's gossip was a map to those truths, however tangled. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. Cherry brought in a tray of scones, still chattering about the village's theories. "They're saying it might be a jealous lover, Miss Marple, or even someone angry about the hospital funds. Can you imagine?" Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking. "People imagine all sorts of things, Cherry. But the truth is often simpler and closer to home." She thought of the scrap of paper with numbers, still unexamined by her, and resolved to ask Inspector Craddock about it. Numbers, she mused, could be a debt, a time, or a code, and each possibility pointed to a different heart. As the firelight danced, Miss Marple's mind wove through the whispers, testing each against the facts. Hargreaves's temper, Emily's letters, Wren's scrapbook, Lydia's chemist, all were pieces of a puzzle, and she knew that Patience would fit them together. The village, with its endless chatter, was her ally. Its gossip, a mirror reflecting the shadows of guilt. She would listen, as she always did, and the truth would emerge as surely as her roses bloomed each spring. Chapter 8. The Backstage Clue. The morning sun filtered through the ancient elms of St. Mary Mead, casting dappled light on the winding path to St. Mary's Theatre. Miss Jane Marple, her lavender shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, walked with a purpose softened by her usual air of gentle curiosity. She had announced her intention to retrieve a lost glove, a pretext as flimsy as the mist still clinging to the hedgerows. But her true aim was to revisit the scene of Madame Vion's poisoning. The theatre, now quiet save for the occasional clatter of a stagehand, held secrets in its shadows, and Miss Marple knew that the smallest detail, a misplaced prop, a forgotten trace, could unravel the mystery like a pulled thread in her knitting. The theatre's foyer was dim, its grandeur muted, without the glow of chandeliers or the hum of an audience. A young usher, polishing the brass railing, nodded as she entered, accustomed to her unassuming presence. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice tinged with the village's lingering unease. "Terrible business, that concert." She smiled, her eyes bright with interest. "Terrible indeed, Tom. I seem to have mislaid a glove. Silly of me. Might I have a look backstage?" The usher hesitated, then shrugged, waving her through. Miss Marple's reputation for harmlessness was her key, unlocking doors that might otherwise remain barred. She passed through the velvet curtains into the backstage corridor, where the air was cool and heavy with the scent of dust and old paint. The green room, her destination, was a cluttered space, its tables strewn with scripts, teacups, and the detritus of a performance cut short. The glass jug from which Emily Trent had poured Madame Vion's water still stood on a side table, its surface dulled by a faint film of dust. Miss Marple approached, her steps soft on the worn floorboards, and bent to examine it. The jug was unremarkable, but she noted a slight residue near the rim, a powdery trace invisible to a less discerning eye. She did not touch it, knowing the police had likely taken samples, but her mind catalogued the detail, recalling the alkaloid poison mentioned by Inspector Craddock. As she straightened, her gaze fell on a small object glinting beneath the table, half hidden by a crumpled program. She knelt carefully, her knees protesting, and retrieved a tiny glass vial, empty but bearing a chemist's label. Its print faded but legible, much Benham Pharmacy. The vial's stopper was missing, and a faint acrid scent clung to it, distinct from the chemical whiff she'd noted near the dressing rooms. Miss Marple's lips pursed, and she slipped the vial into her reticule, her movements as discreet as a shadow. The find was significant, a tangible link to the poison, and she wondered who had been careless enough to leave it behind. Rising, she drifted toward the corridor leading to the dressing rooms, her steps slow to avoid drawing attention. A stagehand, hauling a coil of rope, passed without a glance, and she paused outside Madame Vion's dressing room. The door was closed, but the faint chemical scent lingered, stronger here than in the green room. She noted its proximity to Lydia Crane's dressing room, just 2 doors down, and recalled Mrs. Bantry's gossip about Lydia's conversation with a chemist. Could the vial belong to her, or was it a plant, meant to cast suspicion? Miss Marple's mind turned to her garden, where a misplaced tool could mislead a careless observer, and she resolved to tread carefully. She returned to the green room, where a young woman in a smock was sweeping the floor. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, startled. "Didn't see you there." "Looking for something?" Miss Marple smiled, holding up her glove, a spare she'd brought for the ruse. Found it, thank you, dear. It's so easy to lose things in the bustle, isn't it? The girl nodded, resuming her work, and Miss Marple seized the moment to ask, "Were you here the night of the concert?" It must have been hectic, with so many people about. The girl, eager to talk, leaned on her broom. "Oh, aye, it was chaos. Stagehands, musicians, that Mr. Wren hovering like a moth. I saw Miss Crane, too, flitting about before the show. Said she was checking props, but she looked nervous, if you ask me. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, her needles clicking faintly in her reticule. Miss Crane, you say? Near the green room?" The girl nodded. "Aye, near that table with the jug. Didn't think much of it then, but now—" She trailed off, her eyes wide with a thrill of suspicion. Miss Marple thanked her, her mind racing. Lydia's presence near the jug, coupled with the vial, painted a damning picture, but Miss Marple knew better than to leap to conclusions. She thought of her neighbour's cat, which once left paw prints in her garden, leading her to suspect a thief, only to find the true culprit was a harmless stray. Determined to verify the vial's origin, Miss Marple made her way to Much Benham, a short bus ride away. The pharmacy, a quaint shop with bottles lining its shelves, was tended by Mr. Hodges, a bespectacled man with a meticulous air. She produced the vial, explaining she'd found it near the theatre and wondered about its contents. Mr. Hodges frowned, examining the label. This held an alkaloid compound, used for, well, various purposes, but it's not common. I sold one like it recently to a lady. Said it was for a theatrical effect, something about a play. She was tall, dark-haired, very poised. His description matched Lydia Crane, and Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. "How interesting," she said. "And was it a dangerous substance?" Mr. Hodges hesitated. "In the wrong hands, yes. It's not something we sell lightly." As she left the pharmacy, the vial tucked safely in her reticule, Miss Marple's thoughts were a tangle of threads. The alkaloid, the vial, Lydia's presence near the jug, all pointed to a calculated act, but she knew the danger of a too obvious trail. She recalled a village scandal, when a stolen necklace was found in a maid's room, only to prove a setup by a jealous rival. Could Lydia be the culprit, or was someone using her ambition to cast suspicion? The stagehand's mention of Mr. Wren's hovering presence lingered too, as did Emily's hesitation and Hargreaves's debts. Each was a piece, but the puzzle remained incomplete. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. The scarf grew longer, its pattern as intricate as the mystery before her. She considered the vial, its label a silent witness, and the chemist's words about a poised, dark-haired woman. Lydia Crane's ambition was a bright thread, but Miss Marple knew that truth often lay in the shadows, waiting for a patient hand to draw it out. She would share her find with Inspector Craddock, though she anticipated his sceptical sigh. For now, she would watch and listen, certain that the theatre's secrets, like her roses, would bloom in time. Chapter 9. The Fan's Confession. The pale light of a September afternoon bathed St. Mary Mead in a soft glow, the village's thatched roofs and neat gardens serene despite the undercurrent of unease that lingered from the poisoning at St. Mary's Theatre. Miss Jane Marple, her lavender shawl draped over her shoulders, sat on a bench near the village green, her knitting needles clicking softly in her reticule. She had chosen this spot deliberately, knowing Mr. Percival Wren often passed by after his shift at the post office. His obsessive devotion to Madame Vion, coupled with his evasive answers and the glimpsed notebook filled with her name, had sharpened her curiosity. Miss Marple knew that adoration, like a rose overwatered in her garden, could rot into something dangerous, and she intended to probe Mr. Wren's heart with her gentle, relentless precision. As expected, Mr. Wren appeared, his round face flushed from the day's work, his tweed jacket slightly askew. He carried a small parcel under his arm, and his eyes darted nervously, as if the village's whispers followed him. Miss Marple raised a hand, her smile warm and inviting. "Mr. Wren, how fortunate to see you," she called, her voice as soft as the breeze. "Might you spare a moment for an old lady? I've been so troubled by what happened to Madame Vion." Mr. Wren hesitated, his spectacles slipping down his nose, but her kindly demeanour disarmed him. He shuffled over, sitting awkwardly on the bench's edge. "Of course, Miss Marple," he mumbled. "It's awful, isn't it?" "Poor Madame." She nodded, her eyes bright with sympathy, though they missed nothing. The faint tremor in his hands, the way he clutched the parcel as if it were a shield. "You're so fond of her, aren't you?" she said, her tone gentle. "I saw you with those roses at the concert, and it warmed my heart to see such devotion." Mr. Wren's face lit up, then clouded, his voice faltering. She's a goddess, Miss Marple." Her voice, it's like nothing else. I've followed her concerts for years, everyone I could get to. His words carried a fervour that made Miss Marple's lips purse slightly, recalling a village lad whose fixation on a teacher had led to reckless acts. "You were near the stage door before the concert, weren't you?" she asked, her question as light as a falling leaf. "I thought I saw you speaking to someone." It must be exciting, being so close to her world. Mr. Wren's flush deepened, and he pushed his spectacles up, his nervous laugh filling the air. "Oh, that! I was just waiting, you know, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. I didn't talk to anyone. Not really." His eyes darted to the ground, and Miss Marple noted the lie, as clear as a false stitch in her knitting. She thought of her nephew Raymond, whose fibs as a boy were betrayed by the same averted gaze, and pressed gently. "It's easy to miss things in the excitement," she said, her voice soothing. "But you're so observant, Mr. Wren, with your notebook and all. Did you happen to see anyone near the green room, perhaps near that jug of water?" His hands tightened on the parcel, and he swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Notebook," he echoed, his voice high. "Oh, that's just notes for myself." Nothing important. But his panic was palpable, and Miss Marple's mind turned to the scrapbook Mrs. Bantry had mentioned, its pages filled with fervent scrawls. She leaned forward, her expression one of kindly concern. "You know, dear, sometimes we see things we don't realize matter. You were so close to the stage door, and I'm sure you'd want to help Madame Vion by telling what you saw." Her words were soft, but they carried a weight that made Mr. Wren shift uncomfortably. He opened his mouth, then closed it, his resolve crumbling like dry earth. I did see something," he admitted at last, his voice barely a whisper. "Miss Crane, Lydia Crane. She was in the green room just before the concert. She was near the jug looking furtive, like she didn't want to be seen. I didn't think much of it then, but now—" He trailed off, his eyes wide with fear. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind racing. Lydia Crane again, near the jug, a thread that grew brighter with each tug. "How very helpful, Mr. Wren," she said, her smile encouraging. "And you're certain it was Miss Crane?" He nodded, his hands trembling. "Yes, I'm sure." "I didn't want to say anything because, well, I didn't want to cause trouble, but it was her." His voice cracked, and Miss Marple saw the conflict in his eyes. Loyalty to his idol warring with the need to unburden himself. She thought of a case in her youth when a lovesick gardener had witnessed a theft, but stayed silent to protect his beloved, only to regret it later. "You've done the right thing, dear," she said, patting his hand. "The police will need to know, but you've been very brave." Mr. Wren nodded, his shoulders sagging, as if a weight had lifted. As she rose to leave, she noted the parcel he clutched, a small package wrapped in brown paper with a faint chemical scent that made her pause. "Sending something special?" she asked lightly. He flushed again, muttering, just some old letters, and hurried off, leaving her to ponder. As she walked home, the village green fading into twilight, Miss Marple's thoughts wove through Mr. Wren's confession. His sighting of Lydia Crane was damning, aligning with the stagehand's account and the vial from the pharmacy. Yet his obsession made him an unreliable witness, his perceptions coloured by adoration. Could he have been manipulated, or was he deflecting suspicion? The parcel's scent nagged at her, echoing the chemical whiff near the dressing rooms, and she wondered if it held a clue or a misdirection. In her parlour, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. The scarf grew longer, its pattern as intricate as the mystery before her. She considered Mr. Wren's notebook, his fervent devotion, and his sudden confession. Was he a pawn, or did his love for Madame Villon hide a darker impulse? She recalled the scrap of paper with numbers, still a mystery, and the alkaloid's precise malice. The threads were tightening, but the pattern was not yet clear. She would share Mr. Wren's story with Inspector Craddock, knowing his sigh would greet her village fancies. But Miss Marple knew the truth lay in the small things, the nervous glance, the hidden parcel, the whispered confession, and she would wait, as patient as her roses, for it to bloom. Chapter 10. The Conductor's Secret. The soft glow of a September evening settled over St. Mary Mead, the village's lamplights flickering to life as the sky deepened to indigo. Miss Jane Marple, her lavender shawl draped about her shoulders, sat in her parlour, the fire casting dancing shadows across the familiar chintz and polished wood. Her knitting needles moved with their usual rhythm, the scarf growing ever longer. But her thoughts were far from the wool in her hands. The poisoning of Madame Villon at St. Mary's Theatre remained a puzzle, its pieces scattered like seeds in her garden, and Maestro Julian Hargreaves, with his volatile temper and nervous cufflinks, was a thread she could not yet place. His defensiveness, coupled with village whispers of gambling debts, suggested a man under pressure, and Miss Marple knew that pressure could crack even the proudest facade. Determined to learn more, she had arranged to attend a small gathering at the vicarage, where Maestro Hargreaves was expected to discuss the orchestra's upcoming performance. The vicarage, a rambling house with ivy-clad walls, was a hub of village activity, and Miss Marple knew its informal setting would loosen tongues. She donned her best hat, a modest affair with a single feather, and set out, her steps steady despite the evening chill. The village was quiet, save for the distant bark of a dog and the rustle of leaves, and she used the walk to sift through her thoughts, each suspect a petal in the unfolding mystery. At the vicarage, the drawing-room was warm with candlelight and the murmur of voices. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Price, greeted Miss Marple with a flustered smile, her hands fluttering as she arranged teacups. "Jane, how good of you to come," she said. "The maestro's here, though he's in a mood, snapping at everyone, poor man." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the room. Maestro Hargreaves stood near the fireplace, his broad shoulders stiff, his florid face set in a scowl as he spoke to a group of musicians. His cufflinks glinted as he gestured, and Miss Marple noted their intricate design, a lion's head, perhaps a clue to his prideful nature. She settled into a corner chair, her reticule in her lap, and observed as the conversation turned to the concert. Hargreaves's voice boomed, his irritation barely masked. "The orchestra did its best, despite the chaos," he said, his tone sharp. "If Clara, Madame Villon, hadn't insisted on that infernal Puccini, we might have avoided this mess." His words drew murmurs from the group, and Miss Marple's lips pursed, recalling his earlier complaints about the aria's demands. She thought of her neighbour's son, whose pride had once led him to blame others for his failures, and wondered if Hargreaves's bluster hid a deeper shame. As tea was served, Miss Marple manoeuvred closer, her smile as disarming as ever. "Maestro, you must be under such strain," she said, her voice soft but deliberate. "It's a heavy burden, leading an orchestra through such a tragedy." Hargreaves turned, his scowl softening under her kindly gaze. "It's been a nightmare, Miss Marple," he admitted, tugging at his cufflinks. "The police, the papers, everyone pointing fingers. I was at the podium, in full view. How could I have done anything?" His defensiveness was familiar, but Miss Marple noted a new edge, a weariness that suggested more than mere irritation. "You've had so much to contend with," she said, her tone sympathetic. "I heard there were some financial difficulties, perhaps?" "It must be hard, managing such pressures." Her question was gentle, but it struck a nerve. Hargreaves's face reddened, and his fingers twisted his cufflinks with a ferocity that made them glint in the candlelight. "Gossip, is it?" he snapped, then caught himself, lowering his voice. "I've had some troubles, yes, debts, nothing unusual for an artist, but that's got nothing to do with Clara's poisoning, nothing." His eyes darted to the side, and Miss Marple saw the flicker of fear beneath his bravado. She nodded, her needles clicking faintly in her reticule. "Of course, dear. It's just that money can weigh so heavily, can't it? I knew a gentleman once, terribly proud, who let debts drive him to rash decisions." Her story was vague, but its effect was immediate. Hargreaves's shoulders sagged, and he ran a hand through his dishevelled hair. "All right," he muttered, his voice low. "I owe money, a fair bit, to some unsavoury types in London. I argued with Clara about the concert programme because I needed it to succeed, to keep them off my back. But poison? I'd never stoop to that." His confession, though partial, was a crack in his armour, and Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained serene. She thought of the scrap of paper with numbers, mentioned by Inspector Craddock, and wondered if it could be linked to Hargreaves's debts. A ledger, perhaps, or a threat. "You're very brave to share that, Maestro," she said, patting his arm. "And during the concert, you were always at the podium, weren't you?" No chance to slip backstage. Hargreaves nodded vigorously. "Exactly. The entire orchestra saw me. Ask them." His certainty was convincing, but Miss Marple knew that alibis, like roses, could be cultivated to deceive. As the gathering dispersed, she lingered, chatting with Mrs. Price about the hospital fund. The vicar's wife, ever eager for gossip, whispered, "They say Hargreaves was seen at the station last week, meeting a rough-looking man, probably one of those creditors." He looked terrified. Miss Marple nodded, filing the detail away. She recalled a village merchant whose debts had led to petty theft to appease his lenders, and wondered if Hargreaves's desperation had made him vulnerable to manipulation. Could someone have used his debts to coerce him? Or was he merely a distraction, his temper a flare in the fog? Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. The scarf grew longer, its pattern as intricate as the mystery before her. Hargreaves's confession had clarified his motives, but it also muddied the waters. His debts were a pressure point, but his alibi was strong, and his pride seemed to outweigh any murderous intent. She thought of the vial from the pharmacy, the chemical scent near Lydia Crane's dressing room, and Mr. Wren's sighting of her near the jug. Hargreaves, she suspected, was a red herring, his bluster a distraction from a colder, more calculated hand. She resolved to speak with Inspector Craddock about the scrap of paper, hoping its numbers might shed light on Hargreaves's troubles or point to another suspect. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's needles clicked, and she felt the threads of the mystery tightening. The truth, she knew, was close, hidden in the small things, the twisted cufflink, the whispered debt, the unguarded moment. She would wait, as patient as her garden's roses, for the pattern to emerge. Chapter 11. The trap is set. The golden light of a late September morning filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate shadows across her parlour. She sat by the window, her lavender shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, soothing rhythm. The scarf, now nearly complete, lay in her lap, its intricate pattern a mirror to the mystery that consumed her thoughts. The poisoning of Madame Clara Villon at St. Mary's Theatre had woven a web of suspicion around Maestro Hargreaves, Emily Trent, Mr. Wren, and Lydia Crane, each a thread of motive and opportunity. Yet it was Lydia, with her sharp ambition and proximity to the incriminating vial, who stood out most vividly in Miss Marple's mind. The old lady knew that truth, like a rose in her garden, often bloomed under careful coaxing, and she resolved to set a trap to draw it out. Miss Marple had spent the previous evening pondering the clues: the alkaloid poison, the vial from Much Benham Pharmacy, the chemical scent near Lydia's dressing room, and Mr. Wren's confession of seeing her near the jug. The scrap of paper with numbers, mentioned by Inspector Craddock, remained a nagging enigma. But she suspected it was a distraction, like weeds masking a flower-bed's design. Lydia's calculated poise, her conversation with the chemist, and her role as understudy all pointed to a woman whose ambition might have turned deadly. Yet Miss Marple knew that suspicion alone was not enough. She needed evidence, and a trap was the surest way to secure it. She telephoned Inspector Craddock that morning, her voice as mild as ever. suggesting a plan over a cup of tea at the police station. Craddock, his desk cluttered with reports, listened with a mix of respect and exasperation. "Miss Marple, you and your hunches," he sighed, but his eyes brightened as she outlined her idea. "We'll announce that Madame Villon is recovering and will perform a private recital in a week, with Miss Crane as her understudy," she said, her tone serene. "If the culprit is among our suspects, they may act to ensure Madame does not take the stage again." Craddock rubbed his chin, nodding slowly. "It's risky, but it could work. We'll keep a close watch, and I'll have my men ready." The announcement was made discreetly, through a notice in the village paper and whispers at the Blue Boar. By midday, St. Mary Mead was abuzz with the news. Madame Villon, miraculously improved, would sing at a small event to thank her supporters, with Lydia Crane prepared to step in if needed. Miss Marple, attending a rehearsal at the theatre under the guise of delivering a donation for the hospital fund, watched the players closely. The auditorium was sparsely filled with musicians and stagehands, the air thick with anticipation and unease. Maestro Hargreaves, his cufflinks glinting, conducted with a distracted air, his temper subdued by the weight of recent events. Emily Trent, pale but composed, arranged sheet music, her eyes darting nervously. Mr. Wren lingered in the shadows, his spectacles catching the light as he watched the stage with a fervent gaze. Lydia Crane, however, was the focus of Miss Marple's attention. She arrived in a tailored blue dress, her raven hair impeccable, her smile as polished as a stage curtain. She greeted the stage manager with a nod, her voice carrying a note of forced warmth as she inquired about Madame Villon's condition. Miss Marple, seated near the wings with her knitting, noted the way Lydia's eyes flicked to a small table on the stage, where a new glass of water had been placed for the rehearsal's mock performance. The old lady's heart quickened, for the table was part of the trap. A decoy, as Craddock had arranged for the glass to contain a harmless dye, detectable only under scrutiny. As the rehearsal began, a pianist played a soft accompaniment, and Lydia took her place as understudy, her voice clear but lacking the warmth of Madame Villon's. Miss Marple watched her movements, her needles clicking softly. Midway through a practice aria, Lydia paused, stepping toward the table as if to adjust its position. Her gloved hand hovered near the glass, and Miss Marple's breath caught, sensing the moment she'd anticipated. Before Lydia could act further, Inspector Craddock emerged from the wings, his voice calm but firm. "Miss Crane, a word, please." Lydia froze, her composure slipping for a fraction of a second, her eyes wide with something akin to panic. Craddock, flanked by a constable, held up a small vial, not the one Miss Marple had found, but a replica filled with the dye. "This was placed in the glass, Miss Crane," he said, his tone measured. "A harmless substance, meant to test a theory. You were about to tamper with it, weren't you?" Lydia's face paled, and she drew herself up, her voice sharp. "That's absurd!" "I was merely adjusting the table. It's unsteady. Anyone can see that." But her hands trembled, and Miss Marple noted the faint chemical scent on her gloves, a match to the vial's acrid whiff. The rehearsal halted, the musicians murmuring as Craddock pressed his point. "We've spoken to the chemist in Much Benham, Miss Crane. He recalls selling an alkaloid to a woman matching your description, for theatrical purposes." and witnesses saw you near the jug before the concert." Lydia's eyes darted to the exit, but the constable blocked her path. Miss Marple, her knitting still, spoke softly. "Ambition is a powerful thing, my dear, but it can blind us. Did you think poisoning Madame Vion would secure your place?" Her words, gentle but piercing, struck like a thorn. Lydia's composure cracked, her voice rising. "I didn't mean to kill her. I only wanted her ill, just for a night, so I could sing. She's always overshadowing me." The admission, raw and unguarded, hung in the air, and Craddock nodded, signalling the constable to escort her away. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her mind clear. The trap had worked, drawing out the truth as surely as sunlight coaxed a rose to bloom. As she left the theatre, the village settling into dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the small things. The vial, the scent, Lydia's fleeting panic. She thought of her garden, where a single weed could choke a flower, and knew that Lydia's ambition had been her undoing. The mystery was nearly solved, but the scrap of paper with numbers lingered in her mind, a loose thread she would tie off with Craddock's help. For now, she walked home, her heart light, certain that justice, like her roses, would flourish in time. Chapter 12. The Curtain Falls. The soft glow of lamplight bathed the Saint, Mary Mead Police Station, its modest interior a stark contrast to the grandeur of St. Mary's Theatre, where the drama of Madame Vion's poisoning had unfolded. Miss Jane Marple sat in a wooden chair across from Inspector Craddock's desk, her lavender shawl neatly draped over her shoulders, her reticule resting in her lap. Her knitting needles, silent for once, lay tucked away, for the mystery was unravelling, and her focus was sharp as a thorn. The trap she had suggested had snared Lydia Crane, whose panicked reaction at the rehearsal had betrayed her guilt. Yet Miss Marple knew that a confession, like a rose in her garden, needed careful tending to bloom fully, and she had come to witness the final act. The station was quiet, save for the scratch of Craddock's pen and the occasional murmur of a constable outside. Lydia Crane sat in a small holding room, visible through a glass panel, her raven hair still impeccable, but her face pale, her hands twisting in her lap. Craddock, his expression weary but determined, looked up at Miss Marple. "Your plan worked, Miss Marple," he said, a grudging admiration in his voice. "She cracked like an eggshell when we showed her the decoy vial. But I'd like you here for the formal questioning, if you don't mind. Your insights have a way of cutting through the fog." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes bright with quiet satisfaction. "I'm only an old lady with too much time, Inspector, but I'm happy to help." Her modesty was a shield, but Craddock knew better, and he nodded, gesturing for a constable to bring Lydia in. As she entered, her tailored blue dress seemed out of place in the stark room, and her composure, though strained, held a defiant edge. She sat, her gaze fixed on the table, avoiding Miss Marple's gentle but piercing scrutiny. Craddock began, his tone calm but firm. "Miss Crane, you've admitted to tampering with Madame Vion's water, intending to make her ill. We have the vial from Much Benham Pharmacy, your presence near the jug confirmed by witnesses, and your reaction to the decoy today. But we need the full story. Why and how did you do it?" Lydia's lips tightened, and for a moment silence hung heavy, broken only by the tick of a clock. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft as a summer breeze. "My dear, it's a heavy burden to carry alone." Ambition can cloud even the clearest heart, can't it? The words, gentle but precise, pierced Lydia's defences. Her shoulders slumped, and her voice, when it came, was low and raw. "I didn't want to kill her," she said, her eyes glistening. "I swear it. I only wanted her out of the way for one night, so I could sing the lead. Clara's always been the star, always overshadowing me. I've trained for years, but she never steps aside. I thought a small dose, just enough to make her ill, would give me a chance." She paused, her hands clenching. "I got the alkaloid from the chemist in Much Benham. Told him it was for a theatrical effect. It was so easy to slip it into the jug when Emily stepped away. I didn't think it would be so dangerous." Miss Marple's lips pursed, her mind recalling the vial's acrid scent and the chemical traced near the jug. She thought of her garden, where a misjudged dose of fertilizer had once scorched a rose, and saw in Lydia's act a similar miscalculation, born of desperation. "And the scrap of paper with numbers?" she asked gently. "Was that yours, dear?" Lydia shook her head, confusion flickering across her face. "No, I don't know anything about that." "I didn't leave any paper." Craddock raised an eyebrow, jotting a note, and Miss Marple filed the detail away, suspecting the numbers were a red herring, perhaps linked to Hargreaves's debts or Wren's obsession. Craddock pressed on, his questions methodical. "You knew the alkaloid's effects, didn't you? You chose it deliberately." Lydia nodded, her voice barely audible. "I read about it, thought it would just make her dizzy, unable to sing. I didn't mean for her to collapse like that. When she did, I panicked, but I couldn't say anything. I thought I'd get away with it." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands, the last of her composure crumbling. Miss Marple's expression softened, though her eyes held no sympathy for such calculated malice. She thought of a village girl, years ago, whose envy had led to a petty theft, and saw in Lydia a darker reflection of that same hunger for recognition. "You've been very brave to tell the truth, my dear," she said, her tone kind but firm. "It's the only way to make things right." Lydia's sobs quieted, and Craddock signalled for the constable to take her back to the holding room. Her confession recorded and her fate sealed. As they were left alone, Craddock leaned back, rubbing his temples. "That's it, then," he said. "She'll face charges, attempted murder, most likely. Madame Vion's recovering, thank heavens, and she'll be back to sing soon." He glanced at Miss Marple, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "I don't know how you do it, Miss Marple." That trap was a stroke of genius. She smiled, her needles clicking faintly as she resumed her knitting. "People are predictable, Inspector. Like my roses, they grow toward the light, but they can't hide their thorns." The next day, Miss Marple visited Madame Vion at the hospital, a modest bouquet of her garden's last roses in hand. The soprano, frail but alert, sat propped up in bed, her auburn hair loose about her shoulders. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice weak but warm, "they tell me you helped catch her, Lydia. I can't believe she'd go so far." Miss Marple patted her hand, her smile gentle. "Jealousy is a heavy burden, madame, but you'll sing again, and the stage will be yours." Madame Vion's eyes glistened, and she squeezed Miss Marple's hand in gratitude. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting complete. The scarf, a cascade of soft wool, lay folded in her lap, its pattern a testament to her patience. The mystery was solved, the threads tied, Hargreaves's debts, Emily's secrets, Wren's obsession, all distractions from Lydia's ambition. The scrap of paper remained a loose end, but Miss Marple suspected it was unrelated, a relic of some other village. Drama. As the fire crackled, she sipped her tea, her heart light. The truth, like her roses, had bloomed under her careful tending. And Saint. Mary Mead was quiet once more, its secrets laid bare,